Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for joining us for this amazing conversation, um, courtesy of Africa No Filter. My name is Kelechi Okafor. I'm a writer, director, actor, podcast creator, and social commentator. So it's just been brilliant to be invited to moderate this conversation with such incredible people. So just to give you a brief intro before we launch into all of the things, a little bit about Africa No Filter, if you, for some reason, are not aware. Africa No Filter exists because many stories about Africa still lazily revolve around the single story of poor leadership, poverty, corruption, disease, and conflict. These stories fail to portray the other more progressive side of Africa and collectively perpetuate the narrative that Africa is broken, dependent, and lacks agency. So the result of this is, of course, harmful stereotypes that continue to paint a rigidly negative picture of the continent. So, despite the massive strides that are being made, the mission at Africa No Filter is to shift these stereotypes because they impact the way that the world sees Africa and how Africa therefore sees itself. So, through research, grant making, community building, and advocacy, Africa No Filter supports storytellers to help shift the stereotypical narratives about Africa one story at a time. And so, one of the reasons that we're here today is to talk about the incredible report that's been put together that is called, it focuses on being African, how Africans experience the diaspora. And the co-authors of this were Lusuke Mukongo, Winston Mano, as well as Professor Wallace Chuma, who will be joining us in conversation today. And the aim of the discussion overall is for us to discuss the key findings from this report and discuss recommendations that African governments and host countries can consider about, in terms of implementing them in order to tap into the potential and influence of young Africans in the diaspora. So before we go any further, I'll just talk to you very briefly about the panelists. Like I mentioned, we've got Professor Wallace Chuma, who's the Associate Professor of Media Studies at the University of Cape Town. He co-authored the report, as I mentioned, and Semha Araya, who is a founder and CEO of the Diaspora Academy, and we're going to hear very much about that shortly. Almaz Negas, who is the founder of the African Diaspora Network and an inaugural member of President Biden's Advisory Council on African Diaspora Engagement in the United States. We've got Oluwalake, who is the CEO of the Africa Center, a trustee at the Reader Organization, and a fellow at the RSA, a global network of changemakers and innovators. And we also have, as of today, Jidena, who is an incredible American rapper and singer. And so he'll be talking us through, in conversation with everybody else, about Africa's soft power and how pop culture impacts the global perception of Africa. So without much further ado, I will hand over to Professor Wallace Chuma, who will talk to us about the report as well as the key findings that we'll be going on to discuss as a group.
Thanks a lot, Kelechi, and greetings to everyone. Greetings from Cape Town. I will briefly reflect on the report that two colleagues of mine, Winston Mano and Lusuke Mukongo, did. We worked on it for about 6 months during the course of 2022 and the first part of 2023. The report is based on interviews we did, we conducted in France, in the UK, and in the US. Our sample included young people of the age between 18 and 28, who were either born in the in the host country, so to speak. I use host country with quotes. Either were born in the US, UK, or France, or moved to that country when they were 5 years or younger. So this we refer to as like the first generation African diaspora. And we're interested in a number of things. Yeah, thanks a lot for sharing the questions that we had. We wanted to get a sense of their consumption of global media and how that consumption shaped or influenced identity formation. We wanted to find out how they negotiated that space in the diaspora, the space of being African, but also belonging to a European country or an American country, an American, the United States. So, and methodologically, we proceeded by way of in-depth interviews with the youth that we identified. Typically, an interview would last an hour, and most of the youth we spoke to were college students, university students, and then we analyzed that data using thematic content analysis. Our sample initially, and this was based on what's called a multi-stage sampling. We had 100 in each country, and then we toned that down to 30 in the UK, 30 in the US, and 20 in France. This was based on a range of practical reasons and considerations. So we ended up interviewing 80 people, and so our report is based on those interviews, which we argue can be generalized. The diaspora constitutes a very important component in the host countries that they live in, but also on the African continent because of a whole range of reasons. Think about remittances and so on, but also they are at they are at the receiving end of global narratives, negative narratives about the African continent. And in terms of the key findings, across the 3 countries, we found that the diaspora, young people in the diaspora, continue to face exclusion, subliminal racism, exoticization in the countries that they are based in different ways. And this keeps them sort of vigilant. They are on the lookout for those kinds of experiences. And the other finding is that young people have a very ambiguous relationship with their host countries. They are African insofar as they are Black, but most of them were born in those countries that are living in the UK, in the US, in France, but they are not quite, they don't quite feel that they belong in the PEPs because of the regular experiences of exclusion and racism. At the same time, especially amongst the French diaspora, there was a very ambiguous relationship with the countries of origin, especially those where their parents were born. They couldn't quite feel that they were Mauritian or Algerian or Congolese. In many instances, they could not speak an African language. So those are some of the findings that we had. The other finding was that, and this is across the different countries, there was a sense in which they built strong cultural families within the diaspora. And these families were tied together sometimes through regular cultural events, Kenyan nights, for example, Yoruba nights and cultural groups within the diaspora spaces that they lived in. So that was quite an interesting finding. There was also the other common experience across the 3 countries was that they experienced global media, that is the mainstream media, as representing Africa in very negative stereotypes. So what these young people did was to deliberately go out of their way to search for alternative media that told a different African story. In some cases, this was through deliberately listening to African music and African beats, reading Chimamanda Adichie Ngozi, watching African movies, and many other ways of engagement. So there was a general awareness that the global media representations of themselves, but also of the African continent, were inherently negative. So that was sort of one of the findings. The other finding was, and across the 3 different countries, there was a sense in which the young people felt that they should travel to Africa one way or the other. And they found that traveling to Africa, that sense of mobility, reinforces their claim to Africanness. Many of them had not been to the continent, but they felt that in their lifetime, they had to travel. They also felt that their knowledge of the continent currently was not enough. So that travel at some point in their life was considered critical. So I think that without spend much time, I think this is like a snapshot of the results that we found. There was that sense of constant negotiation of one's identity, shaped by the lived experiences in those spaces, but also shaped by some of the mediated experiences through the interaction with the media, including social media platforms. So I think maybe at this point I can open the space to conversations. What do you think, Kelechi?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Wallace. Thank you for sharing the findings with us. Somebody was asking in the Q&A if it would be possible to get a link to the report of the research. I think that will be sent over by the hosts.
Yes.
And in case you haven't participated just yet, there are questions to take part in the poll as well. So if you want to interact with that, just by clicking along your screen, you should see the option to do so. And if you have any questions for the panelists, please do put it in through the Q&A section so we can ask them as well. Obviously, knowing that we're tight on time, I wanted to kind of open and kind of, send this over to the first question to Semha to talk about the young diasporas, really, because I know that this is something that you are really passionate about with the academy that you set up as well, and that you lead up on. How important it is to have young people's voices as part of these conversations, and how we look at our history, how we look at our future, and how we actually navigate the present. So it'll be great to hear from you. And Jiden, if you want to kind of chime in on that too, that would be great.
Yeah, let me answer that and give room for my brother so he can riff on his work as well. So what we know from the diaspora experience is that being away from home is a painful at times memory, but also a moment of pride. And whether you're African or not, we know that the diaspora experience does exist in many different forms. For Africans, however, it is multi-layered, and it is so deeply, deeply complicated to unpack because of the history of what forced us to move. In many cases, multi-generational descendants of the enslaved have created new communities all around the world. First-generation migrants, like the ones that this report reflects, have a memory of home in their own lives. And it's really that journey of being connected or desiring to become connected that we're all aspiring for. And for those that have left home and that have a memory of home, especially if you are of a younger generation, you're looking to bring both worlds together, to be a part of the home that you left or the part of the home that you are descendant from, but also infuse the new part of you, which for me as an Eritrean American, I'm also very American, but I'm American with the lens of a Black woman, an African woman, and a very Eritrean woman. And all of that together should be okay, because that hyphenated experience, that lived hyphenated experience that we have as Africans is rich, it's powerful, it's beautiful. It deserves to be unpacked, it deserves to be honored. And I think what's exciting is that young people, they can see both ends of that spectrum and see the possibilities of how it comes together. The question is, how will countries, how will governments, how will states, how will communities really create that space? I do believe that one of the biggest entry points that young people have the headway in is in culture, is in storytelling, is in art, is in preservation, and it's through work of inspiring artists like Jidena that open up that space. And having you here is just really beautiful, because I think what you're doing is not just through your music and your own personal story, you're also amplifying and supporting diaspora spaces and organizations I know you're very involved in. So I'd love to hand it over to you to continue that, if that's all right, Kelechi. I hope I answered it.
Yeah, that was
You
great.
did.
Thank you, Jidena. Off you go.
Thank you so much. I mean, the work that you're doing, I mean, it's mutual. We're in the same spaces, and thank you so much for that relay and for eloquently sharing what it truly is like to be in the diaspora, specifically on this side of the water. Shout out to everybody on the call. I've followed many of your work, especially being introduced to it through my sister Neka Mobison and her work at MDoc. So it's an honor to share this call with everybody. I think just to echo Semhar's points, I think that so oftentimes when you're in the diaspora, the first thing that your family says is, at least I'll speak as a Nigerian American. My father told me, you know, you are here on the back, you are here on my back. You're here because I came from my village, and you get your storyline, and you know, you go through your name. And then my father used to talk about Nigeria as a whole, Nigerian Americans, and so you get this whole myth, and not to say that it's fictitious, but it's a myth to drive you towards excellence. The one thing that my father did not say is I'm also here on the backs of African Americans. If you're in the UK, Caribbean Americans went through, you know, hell and high water for many of the Africans that came after that first generation. So that was the piece that was missing. And as you grow, and especially as you travel and you go back to your homeland, me, it was 12 years since I had left. I left when I was 6. I went back to Nigeria, and I was shocked to find out how Americanized I was. So then you're like, man, everyone's you got home, you're home, but you're like, dang, I don't really feel home all the way. That's when your multi-hyphenate personality starts. You get back home, then you feel more African than you did when you left. So that conversation in your head is really difficult to make sense of. But the more you travel, I think that travel was like the biggest thing for me. The more you do, the more you accept that, hey, as somehow said, for me, I'm Nigerian American, but I'm also Black American. It's not really one or the other. I'm a special product of being first gen. And I think everybody on the call has that. And the great news is that the younger generations, younger than myself even, is that they are focusing on the nuances. I think Gen Z's gift to the world is nuance. Everyone gets caught in different conversations, whether it's gender, sexuality, but I think it also very much applies to this conversation.
Thank you so much, Jidena. Thank you. And yeah, it is important to connect the dots. And I think that that's why it's fascinating and amazing that we are having this conversation. So we are connecting the dots as the African diaspora. And as you say, remembering history properly, not misremembering and forgetting those who actually had to come through essentially first for us to be able to come through and weave the stories that we've been able to weave together in the tapestry of our lives. So I wanted to come to you, Olu, as well as Almaz, and ask you about institutions, how institutions function as it pertains to, young African diasporans. How does it? Because oftentimes, especially when we think about the Black Lives Matter movement that was highlighted in the report as well, we've got young Africans who are having to or wanting to retrace their heritage if it wasn't very prevalent or pertinent to them prior, wanting to know where they fit in, because institutions historically and presently speaking haven't necessarily been very kind to them.
Thank you, Kelechi. And yes, that's a really, really important and powerful place from which to start, because we all know institutions, but institutions don't always know us, and especially know young people or know how to engage with young people. I sit here as the head of an institution that's been around for 60 years. This is the 60th anniversary of the Africa Center. And it started 60 years ago as a place for Africans to connect, to educate themselves about each other, and to advocate on behalf of each other. Now, the issues that they were dealing with then in the 60s were very, very different to the issues that they were dealing with in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and now. But the people tend to find themselves stratified within the history and the heritage of what those institutions have done, rather than ensure that they remain relevant for now and for the future. And the now and the future is the young people. So any institution that does not have an active program, and even beyond an active program, does not have a critical strategic question that it asks itself for every single agenda item at every board meeting. It's not asking the question, and how does this impact and how are we involving young people? It's not, frankly, fit for purpose, because it's not relevant to the future to the current generation and to the leaders of the future of that organization. And that's one of the motivations the Africa Center for establishing a Young Africa Center, which is a group of 18 to 35-year-olds who volunteer to work in the organization, developing their own program of activities, which speaks to their own needs and desires, but also challenges the organization, challenges the institution as to what it's doing, and helps a kind of internal sense checking of our strategy and our objectives. It's really powerful to have them. They develop their own project Homecoming, which consists of a number of programs and events, which are very much all in line with the findings of the report. So there was a program on identity formation on African spirituality and philosophy. There was a program on economics and how they engage with Africa and what they learn from Africa. There was a program on travel and how they, identify themselves or enable themselves to reach out physically as well as emotionally to the continent. So I think that's a really powerful example of, how institutions need to engage. The other quick point I will make is the role that institutions then play in changing the narrative about young African diasporans, but also helps them as well to navigate the untold histories of the struggles of people who have come before them as well, which is critically important in helping them feel that sense of belonging and changing identity formation narrative that they have.
Thank you so much, Olu. Almaz, as being involved as it pertains with governmental policies as well, are there findings, are there thoughts that you have on the idea of, or the very real reality of how institutions and young people of the diaspora, how they interact?
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity. It's wonderful to be with all of you. Let me just, I've been reflecting because it's always good to be the last. And I've been reflecting on what Samhar said, what Jidena said. In fact, Jidena, and of course, Olu on the institutionalizing and how institutions and the diaspora interact. And really thank you, Professor Wallace, for putting the study together. So I had a chance to review it simply because of this transformation of the African Diaspora Network. We started this organization 14 years ago when nobody was really talking about diaspora. Very few of us. I remember Samhar had Dawn and a few others, but really this was a nascent area. What I think is amazing is the number of interest on diaspora engagement, not only from institution, the very small organization, to governments, the EU, even now the Asians and the United States, really looking at the diaspora as a fuel for economic development, not only in the countries where we come from, but also in the countries where we live in, which we contribute the most. And so I think this transformation includes who? It includes the youth. And for us, for ADN, which we started, me being an immigrant from Eritrea. I came here as a foreign student many years ago. Don't ask me how many years ago. It's been a long time. But what's great about that is when I started at ADN, we were just a few of us from the Eritrean, Kenyan, Ghanaian community in Silicon Valley, just getting together to figure out how can we bring our community together? How can we have our voices be heard? How can the work that we have been doing in this community get to be known? And so that when people speak about Africa, we are at the table. It's how it started. But in fact, honestly, I did not even have the thinking of whether it's a youth or not. Really, I was just going with the immigrants that I know. But here's where we are today. So it is not just only on policy side that many governments are interested in interacting and including the diaspora, which I'm so grateful for and happy and proud of. But even ADN really got transformed. I have a team member who can put on the chat, but we created the Builders of Africa's Future on the continent, not just only to talk here, but really to see, we get together, so what does it mean? What does it mean to the young generation on the continent? So we built something called the Builders of Africa's Future. We're about to bring the 7th cohort of that group. They don't just only participate, we also negotiated with the government of the United States. As many of you may know, if you don't, you must know this, there is money appropriated for the continent by Congress. As you may or may not know, usually African governments don't really tap into these resources. We wanted to tap it from the United States side, so we made a very meaningful partnership with the U.S. Africa Development Foundation. And so everyone who goes through this program gets $25,000 in grant. That's a fantastic thing for our community to get 20. Who are these? These are the very people we're talking about. They're very young. They are the future of the continent. Well, let's reverse that back into the United States. We also have a program, which I think someone said we are on the back of African Americans. I always say my life is possible because somebody else suffered for me. And the people who suffered for me are the African Americans. So we started something called Accelerating Black Leadership and Entrepreneurship. We're going to the 4th cohort for that one. We provide training and everything. Who are these people entering that program? They are African Americans and Africans from the diaspora. Why? Because funding, and this is critical, we talk about as if this is, it's not all and for me, it's not all segregated or separated. It's actually integrated. We start something and we try to really get the funding for it. We actually fail over and over and over because access to funding is extremely difficult for Black entrepreneurs. In fact, less than 3% of Black-led organizations get funding from the VCs or others, but most of it is really looked at through the African-American experience. But then when my 24-year-old son goes out, nobody says he's Eritrean American. He's an African American, period, because that is how he looks like. So we are seeing movement, but I am not seeing the kind of change I want to see, which is why including the younger generation in the work we do is so critical. The other thing that we've done, and I will end by saying this, the challenge we face or the assumption is that immigrants from Africa come to the United States. Well, actually, 70 to 80% of migration happens within Africa. It's intra-Africa migration. And if it is intra-Africa migration, then the stereotypical words that we hear, Nigerians are coming to take over, Kenyans are coming, these are coming. That is not true. We're actually migrating internally. And for that, there's a new program called the Young African Leadership Institute, like Localized Legacy. This is a USAID new program that started in 4 countries, in Senegal, Kenya, South Africa, and Ghana. ADN got lucky, so we're one of the subcontractors, also to support what? The younger generation, the younger leaders. What is the diaspora role in there? It's not for us to do everything for them, but at least if we can mentor them, if we can be a part of their journey to get them ready to what is life providing them, whatever that might be, I think it's really the greatest gift we can give to our younger generation. So to make this short and go back to the original question, the institutions, whether they like it or not, whether we like it or not, we're here to stay. And we're going to make sure that whether it's our children, our community members, the younger generation, well, first of all, Africa is the youngest continent in the world, deal with it. But we also have a role to play in it. And so I feel very fortunate to do the work I do. And I feel extremely fortunate that I have actually younger generation that I can see them really thriving. Then the question continues to be, how can the diaspora go beyond being transactional, where we only send remittances to our family, to transformational, where we invest, because we need to invest on the continent so that we can reduce the number of the need for remittances, so we can create a vibrant economy. Remittances is not the answer. We've been doing this for generations, generations after generation. We are going beyond remittances, and we have a program initiative on that. And I look forward to working with everyone, because it's time to invest back on the continent, whether it's with our time, our knowledge, our money. So thank you.
Can I add
Thank
to
you,
that?
Almaz. You said everything. Somehow you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I want to underscore that what Almaz is sharing is a perfect example of how diasporas can stand themselves up and become institutionalized. Both the Africa Center and the African Diaspora Network are examples of diasporas taking their organizing a step further into creating institutions. What's important to note is institutionalizing means many different things. It could be a small business, it could be a charity organization or a nonprofit, it could be a community organization, and it could be, a for-profit entity. The idea is that whatever ways that diasporas in the diaspora want to make impact, it depends on two things. It depends on the country that you reside in and the opportunities they have for you to stand yourself up. So in the United States, forming a nonprofit and finding funding is a journey of its own. You can also start a company or a business. But in other countries, the UK will have a different set of rules. France, Germany, all these other, each country has its own sort of environment of opportunity. But what's key here is the institutionalization, whatever it looks like, is key. Because I think as Africans, we are so communal and so about the community. We tend to do things through relational approaches that remain informal. And the problem there is nothing gets recorded, nothing gets captured in data. That's why this report is so critical. So remittances end up being the thing we talk about the most because those are numbers that are caught by governments reporting out how much they get from outside. But you probably send a lot more than the remittances that go through Western Union, MoneyGram, or World Remit, whoever you use, because you probably go to your homeland with gifts and items and things that no one ever knows about. So we really don't have a proper capture of diaspora impact, both where we live and how we connect to our homelands, because we're not institutionalizing it and capturing it. So I just really want to emphasize that all of us who feel like we want to help our homelands, the first thing is to look at what already exists and what needs support. These institutions are great examples. Or you can start your own. I mean, there's a special space that people like Jadena sit in, which is the artist and the sort of individual creative space. And that is like powerful. As a writer, as a storyteller, as a performer, you are going above, like in some ethereal, like global impact, but not everyone has those gifts. But if you think of what your time, talents, and treasures are, and you think of what you're capable of doing where you reside, I believe that diasporas can make impact from where they are. And I believe that it does include travel, but don't think that travel will resolve it. Because now in this age of digital technology, of social media, of the internet, you can transfer your skills. You can support local organizations on the continent. You can build space, create spaces you wish existed. But the catch is it has to be done right. It has to be done legally, formally, and there's a whole process for that. So don't discount the fact that you may live in the UK or the US or France or whatever country you're in, and you may not feel that this is your homeland, but those homelands offer you ecosystems and a regulatory framework that you can build something. So I'm really big about social entrepreneurship. I believe that all of us as Africans are innately built with this ability to build community and to convene. But what they don't want you to do is formalize, is stand up and become multi-generational. If you look at any diaspora experience, African or not, I am rooted in the African experience, but I now work globally. When you look at really where diasporas make impact, it's in their ability to institutionalize, preserve our narratives, celebrate our heritage, have discussions about contemporary issues. And for diasporas from the global South, particularly Black and Brown, we are then often not landing in countries where we are the minority, but we're also up against very real structures of white supremacy, very real structures of institutional racism, very real structures of the decay and disparity from colonialism and slavery. And we are in homelands where we don't know how to navigate. It's incumbent that you learn immediately how to formalize, how to build your power, how to launch it. And that's where I am now in terms of what I focus on. But I feel like we spend a lot of time reinventing the wheel and then we become disillusioned. We are smarter than anyone else. Being a migrant, having left your homeland, going somewhere new, the migrant journey is the most powerful journey. I'm also very, very firm in my belief that the diaspora experience is truly a feminist experience. And men, my brothers, don't be afraid of that word, because what it means is to be in the diaspora is to allow more opportunities for all our people so that we can give back home. It is now in the diaspora, women discover more opportunities than we probably had in our homelands, because in addition to the cultural and existing opportunities women have in our countries, there are more likely than not a wider set of opportunities for women. So I believe like the diaspora opens up the richness of our people because men and women are able to grow. Men and women are able to contribute. And I just really want you to think about your time, talent, and treasure, and the privilege you have of where you are, even with all of its burdens, with all of its pain. The fact that you can leverage that to give back. Giving back looks like so many things, but think of your power and think of how you formalize.
Thank you, Samar. I just want to make sure that we have a lot, enough time for everyone, and we've got the questions flooding in as well. But everything you've said there was filled with such richness and gems that we definitely need to take on board. There's a question that really caught my eye here. Big up yourself, Mikhail. I see that you're in the chat as well. Large up your chest. I'll come to your question soon. Anne-Marie makes a very salient point, which I think is really important when we're having discussions such as these. We tend to sometimes romanticize how we talk about giving back to the continent, how we develop the continent. And it's important that you mentioned about institutions as well, and how we have different interactions or understandings of the word. Because me personally, even though I'm moderating this conversation, I have a particular view of capitalism and institutions. So this is the space where we can agree and disagree as to how we do certain things. But Anne-Marie, you make a very great, you put a very great question forward here, where you said, drawing on the definition given by the AU included in the report, which emphasizes willing to contribute to the development of the continent, as Africans in the diaspora, what should using our resources, privilege, proximity to economic power look like? How do we ensure we are not only claiming being African when it benefits us, therefore replicating patterns of extraction of the continent? And I think this is super important. As somebody that's building a children's home currently in Nigeria, having left Nigeria when I was 5 and growing up in the UK, going to build a children's home and a resource centre in Nigeria, I had to check myself. As Jadena mentioned earlier, even, I'm going as a British person, whether I like it or not. No matter how much I cuss out Britain, I am going essentially as a British person. It's because of growing up in Britain that I've been afforded certain privileges to be able to take these things and to then help to build some kind of framework, some kind of infrastructure in Nigeria, but being very aware of not going with the extractive mindset, because that is what happens when we are honed and bred or reared in imperialist states. We do end up having, whether we realize it or not, remnants of colonialist mindset. So I want to come to you first, Olu, because there was, and I love that we're in this conversation together. There was an incident where the Africa Centre invited Prince Charles at the time to the Africa Centre, and it was met with some uproar. I was one of them. It was met with some uproar, but there are reasons, right? So when we talk about giving back to the continent or developing the continent or our idea or of our identities in the places where, in these host countries, and that being projected onto the continent, how do you mitigate that? How do you balance that? Because the monarchy is an institution.
Thanks, Rashia. That's an interesting one. Disclaimer here, I was not in post at the time of that visit. And my reaction may not have been too dissimilar to yours, but my board didn't hear me say that. It's a very interesting one because institutions of necessity and by their very nature are part of an ecosystem. And that ecosystem does include instruments of authority and arms of administration that have not necessarily always been acting in our interests. So that's a very salient point, which we always have to bear in mind. On the other hand, we can't ignore the facts that they exist. There is a monarchy. We do reside in the UK in a constitutional monarchy. There is a history of that monarchy and how it has impacted on people of African descent and the African continent. In many ways, it still is. And that same conversation, there are other institutions that it applies to as well, like the church, for instance, is a very, very key one as well, that we need to bear in mind on that as well. So the role of institutions that are going to be relevant in having those conversations as part of that ecosystem is very, very important and very, very powerful as long as it's done right. And to do it right means to ensure that the conversations that you are utilizing that position of being an institution to ask and to seek answers for are the questions that are of interest and to the benefit of our people at this point in time. So those conversations should include, for instance, things like climate justice. It should include things like restitution of stolen art. It should include things like race and racism and the kind of policies that are in place at the moment that are debilitating for the young African diaspora and so on. Some of that conversation happened when the King visited the Africa Center last year. A lot of it didn't. The important thing is utilizing that as a starting point to be able to have those conversations. And it's quite interesting as well, this year being our 60th anniversary and going through the archives of the organization, it's interesting to note that from the beginnings of the organization, where effectively it was supported very much by the Catholic Church, the organization has morphed into one where it has challenged the Catholic Church in many ways on what it's done, the role it's played in on the development of Africa and the role that it can play in restitution of that as well. So the important point I'm trying to make here is institutions serve a dual purpose for the African diaspora, and we should not shun them because they're institutions and because it might seem that they are part of that system. We need to utilize them to challenge that system and to drive our interests.
Thank you, Olu. That was amazing. Thank you so much. Jidena, I'll lead on to you then. Still kind of staying on the conversation or the question that Anne-Marie asked, we are seeing a globalization of African, in inverted commas, African culture, especially West African culture with the way that music, food and people going, for Dirty December in, Ghana, Nigeria, that sort of thing. We're seeing all of these things happening. When you are experiencing all of this, do you pick up on the sense of like conflict maybe? Because people are going, but are they putting into the country or the countries that they visit in the same way? Or is it more of a perpetuation of the kind of tourist, very kind of Western tourism sort of vibe that they're taking to Africa, which is more extractive than actually giving back?
I mean, first of all, thank you, Kelechi, for taking the filter off of Africa, no filter. You did that very eloquently. I love it. Second of all, somehow I completely believe that the diaspora era that we are in is a womanist led moment, and I don't think it's just a moment. I think it's on a larger degree, it is the time, and I think we'll see that effect of the diaspora's intel on the continent and vice versa over time. And thank you, Olu, for sharing what you did as well. I had a note about what you said, and I'll return to it. I think that we are, yes, of course, people are going to Accra, for example, to see the sand, to party. That's okay. I know a lot of people on Twitter and whatnot, on threads, just like, oh, this is not the only thing that we have. Now everybody's focusing on the wrong thing. No, if you look at history, the first thing that happens is travel. The second thing is trust. The third is trade. The travel started, I was one of the full circle committees that created the year of return. We started this in like 2016, 2017 with a small group of people. We were very intentional about leading up to 2019 and going into the year of return. And furthermore, we want to put a light on other African regions so that not everyone is just going to Accra. That is what the reason I bring that up is because Can you guys hear me? What's important to note is that travel also happens virtually. The fact that people were able to see artists and people on the continent for maybe the last like 7 years, that allowed people to trust. Oh, that person looks cool. They look like my uncle. This person gets a haircut just like me. Like, it's amazing what simple, basic rituals do to the human mind. Once you trust, then I can trade. So I think we're still in an early phase, and we can't. We're trying to rush back after 500 years of colonialism and slavery and 1,000 years of kind of Africa's dark ages, to be honest. And for many people, or let's say 700 years. I think that one of the things that we can do is first not using this term give back. I use the term build up, because I'm not giving back. Africa, it's not like Africa needs my help. It's more that we're, as a human being, I'm just working to build what I see wherever I am on the planet, and especially where I'm from. That's one. Two, I think there's a bunch of policies that you can create. I probably have the same or similar politics to you, Kelechi, and maybe you, Olu, but I do believe there's certain institutions and policies that can be put in place that would change everything. A classic example is the story of pad thai. Many of you here have probably eaten Thai food. If you were alive in the 90s, and some of us were, some people 60s, 70s, 80s, you probably didn't have a lot of Thai food. In 2002, the government of Thailand created a gastro diplomacy policy that focused around creating a national dish called pad thai. They changed their national dish to pad thai. Pad thai is not a traditional dish whatsoever, but it does have the ingredients. And what they did was they took 1 million US and eventually became 15 million over years to subsidize the development of Thai restaurants. And so they would give you money as a small business owner. You had to have pad thai on the menu. And the goal was to create foreign interest in Thailand, to make Thailand be more interesting, and also to obviously feed the pockets of the Thai diaspora. That's a classic example of where diplomacy actually creates an interest into a country, and it allows it to be more welcoming. If we did the same thing for 54 countries in Africa, actually Ethiopia doesn't need any help. Eritrea maybe is next up in terms of the presentation of food. The rest of us, though, we got some work to do. That's the kind of thing that we can do in the diaspora. If you have an interest in something cultural that you want to set up here, maybe there's a conversation to be had with, Amaz, of course, to find out where are the funds coming from your home country. You don't have to travel to do that. So these are the kind of things that I think we can do wherever we are.
Can I just follow up? I am smiling, as you can see. I just love what you just said. Everything you said makes so much sense to me. Yes, we're not giving back. We're going to invest. That's what you're talking about. We're going to invest because there is a return on investment for us. The other thing you talked about is the food politics or the food diplomacy. You know who's the other one who's done this? And I've been a part of it, so I know this in the Valley, especially in California, Peru. There are so many Peruvian restaurants. How it started was about 15, maybe 20 years ago. I was a part of that movement for my Peruvian friends. In fact, I have a Peruvian paint right here, a picture in my office that came from a friend of mine who I helped, I think in some ways, it was for that same thing. They were so frustrated in Silicon Valley that their culture was not known. People go to Machu Picchu, I don't know how to say it, but to go, but yet they don't eat their food. Right now, I'm telling you, there is one in Mountain View, and I'm going to say this because I think that's where you're heading. And I'll tell you what we've done at ADN that I think makes me so proud. And it has nothing to do with the Ethiopian food. They created a restaurant locally here. You cannot get a reservation. You have to do this like a month in advance. That's a Peruvian food. Who subsidizes that? The Peruvian government. I'm just going to go to the Nigerian food, the West African food. So we're doing a symposium, which I'm going to just put it here. Symposium coming up in March. But because we're doing it at a hotel, in the past, we did it at a museum so we could bring Ethiopian food, East African food, we call it, and then West African food. So we have a woman, Nigerian, wonderful, wonderful caterer. So this hotel said, no, we cannot bring from other place. Oh, well, yes, you can. So we negotiated for her to enter her food in the menu or for a Thursday lunch jollof, because it is a very well-known West African food. And unless I take responsibility to make sure that people know what this is, we're not changing anybody. Food brings people together. I just want to say to you, for bringing that up, if there is anything I can do for the West African governments to make sure that this happens, I think we must do it, because I think there's something that you just said that makes so much sense, because it's food. Yes, Ethiopians probably don't, and Eritreans always call themselves as Ethiopian restaurants, but in that case, we're all good. The food is the same. And I just love what you said. And I think it's very, very important we do that. And it's also timely that we do that.
Yes, Almaz. Like, thank you, Jadena, for saying, because look at Almaz lit up. She's like glowing. She's like, yes, food.
I love it. I love this. I
People
just
were
love
in the
it.
chat like Injera, like everyone was going. So it's great because we have a hard stop for 5 p.m. I just wanted to bring this back briefly to Wallace, very, very briefly, and then hopefully close out with anything else that you would all like to share. I wanted to ask you, Wallace, about the fact that it says here that although the experience of being discriminated against was felt by both men and women participants, women shared the most anecdotes. Why would you think that is? Because I know that Semha touched on it earlier, that what we're doing here in terms of the work that we're doing is, about Black feminism, is about womanism. It is womanist in essence. And, Jidena built on that. Why do you think that it was women that shared more so their anecdotes throughout this report?
Thanks a lot, Kelechi. I mean, the fascinating conversations we're having here. I mean, I love it. I love it. Good question. The women in France, particularly, shared their anecdotes about being exoticized. And in the report, you'll see comments, direct quotations about people, stopping them by the street to ask whether it was their real hair, which was that straight, and all those kinds of demeaning interventions, sometimes from strangers. I'm not sure that I have an answer to the question, to the fact that why the women, because it could be because of the patriarchal nature of the societies in which these people are, the diaspora are, or that the male interviewees were not willing to share their experiences of that, of being discriminated against. So I'm not sure if I've got one answer, but I think something that I need to say here is, from all the interviewees, we got a sense that there is hunger for content, for information, for narratives that present Africa differently out there. And I think one of the people commented about the importance of creating content about Africa that is more nuanced, that encourages people, where people can see themselves and can identify, because what is out there largely is a plethora of negative stereotypes about Africa. Even in the age of AI and all that now, there's a huge requirement for content that humanizes Africa.
Thank you, Wallace. Look at you lot's lives. It's only when we started talking about food that you started going in the chat, and now everyone's asking for where there's a cookout. Look at what you've started. One of the great conversations, one of the great points that was made by Semha when we were putting all of this together, when we had our briefing call, Semha mentioned about hope. So with the 3 minutes or so that we have left, as you mentioned, Wallace, about the negative stereotypes that we know about Africa and why Africa No Filter wanted us to have this conversation so we can recalibrate our perspectives when we are thinking about the continent. Semha, could you speak to us, please, about hope and how we go forward with this work that we are all clearly collectively doing?
Yeah, I think you have to remember that no matter where you are, home is in your heart. Home is where you are. It's what you carry. And your memories of homeland, or the narratives that you have of your people, Those are the first ignition of hope. And then your job, wherever you are, is to discover that and to create. I firmly believe that you are where you are to create and offer the world something powerful, especially as people of African descent. You have the gifts to tell your story and to make sure that everyone knows who we are. So remember, there are realities to living in parts of this world that are deeply unjust, deeply painful, deeply horrific. And yet you are where you are so that you can discover and create. And as Jadena said, build up, right? So you're not giving back, you're building up, because you are powerful, but so are our brothers and sisters back home. So hold on to that hope and keep this mind open. Discover yourself. This is exciting. Thank you guys for having us.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Africa No Filter, for having us. It's been an incredible conversation. I feel like we could have just talked for hours and hours. Thank you all so much to the people who just joined us today, as you know, the audience and everything else, and how active you've been in the chat as well. I'm really sorry that we didn't get through all of the questions that some of you were asking in the Q&A, but I was hoping to like kind of fold it in the conversations that we were having anyway. Thank you so much to the panelists. Like, it's been great for us to talk in this way, and I hope that this leads on to more conversations and more things to do with policy as well. Africa No Filter is asking for you to take 1 minute to fill out the evaluation form that's just been put in the chat as well. And yeah, it's been truly wonderful and an honor to participate in this conversation with you all. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Africa No Filter, one of our funders. We appreciate you. We love the work you've done, and really, Jidena, I'll email you. I really love what you just said. It's just so beautiful. Okay, we'll make the food happen. I saw someone said it's the Ghana. Yes, we do love to go after each other, but can I just say it's the Africa, and it's beautiful. So we're gonna be very transformative and really forget at one point where we come from. That's my hope.
Yeah. See?
That's my
See,
hope.
I
Really,
like how
we
you're
go
thinking.
beyond our borders, and we become
Yeah,
one
because the
human
borders,
being.
that's
One
not our
Africa,
history.
one
That's not
Africa.
our
One
history at
Africa.
all.
Yes,
Yeah.
one
Thank you.
Africa. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful
Blessings.
day. Bye-bye. Thank
Thank you all
you.
so
You
much.
take care.
Bye-bye.
All right.
Bye.
Right.
Bye.